The dog wouldn't stop barking. Its voice cut through the dusty silence of the Texas plains like a warning, frantic and sharp. The women froze, half a dozen Japanese POWs, their feet blistered, their uniforms tattered, eyes wary beneath the broad-brimmed shade of a hot American afternoon. They had been told nothing, only that they would work today, on a cattle ranch not far from the camp. Then came the barking, and then silence. Not from the dog, but from the cowboys. Big men in denim and boots, leaning on fence posts, watching. All talk ceased. One spat into the dirt, another adjusted his hat. Their eyes narrowed, not with malice, but with something more complicated. Recognition, maybe, or disbelief. One man stepped forward, silent, slow, and removed his hat. What the women didn't know, what the Hound seemed to sense, was that one of them bore a face he had seen before. Not here, but in the Pacific. The dog's bark shattered the stillness like a glass dropped onto concrete, sharp, sudden, and full of panic. The Hound, an aging blue heeler with gray at the muzzle and clouded eyes, had been dozing near the gate when the truck pulled up. But now it stood rigid, tail down, ears pinned back, howling with such urgency it almost seemed like grief. The women froze where they stood, boots kicking up the dry dust of the Texas earth. Their uniforms, ill-fitting and sun-bleached, hung on their frames like foreign skin. None of them spoke. They didn't have to. The dog had already said enough. From the far fence line, 4 cowboys looked up. The one who had been coiling rope paused mid-loop. Another, leaning against a post, squinted into the distance. The third man stopped chewing his tobacco and wiped his hand on his jeans. The fourth cowboy, the tallest of them, with a limp in his right leg and a face more lined than the others, stepped forward a little, slowly, deliberately. And then, like dominoes toppling in slow motion, every cowboy went silent. No greetings, no jokes, no orders. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that stretched too long to be polite. The Hound barked again, then whimpered, then growled low and steady, as if something old and buried had been unearthed. The truck's engine sputtered and died. Dust still hung in the air like smoke. The American soldier in the passenger seat gave a lazy wave to the cowboys, but got nothing in return. One of the women coughed, dry, nervous. Another fidgeted with her collar. They had no idea what had changed, only that it had. Then came the glance. She was the third woman from the left, a nurse once. Her hair, tied back loosely, had come undone during the ride. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms dappled with old scars. Burns, most likely. She shifted her gaze upward, more out of instinct than courage, and met the eyes of the cowboy with the limp. He didn't blink. His hat was in his hand now, not out of politeness, out of something older, something harder. Reverence, maybe, or rage. Their eyes locked, not in confrontation, but recognition, not of faces, but of moments, of memory. And though neither spoke, the exchange between them passed like electricity. Not what have you done, but where have I seen you? Because the truth was this: the cowboy had been there too. Not in the same tent, not under the same flag, but on the same island. Tarawa, or maybe Peleliu, or somewhere in that blur of jungle and blood. He remembered medics shouting in Japanese. He remembered the face of a young woman kneeling beside a dying soldier, pressing a rag to his side, her hands shaking but relentless. He remembered that not all enemies held rifles, and she saw something else entirely, a different face, younger, but still marked by the same deep-set eyes and broken gait. A man crawling across a field of flame, dragging another behind him. A flash of hesitation, a hand that didn't fire. Had it been him? Neither of them knew. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The past was now a living thing, standing between them in the Texas sun, wagging its tail and baring its teeth. The soldier at the truck door barked an order, too sharp, trying to cut through the tension. The women began to move again, slow and hesitant. They climbed out, lined up. The dog quieted, but didn't sit. Its eyes stayed on the nurse. The cowboys watched. One adjusted his belt. Another turned away to spit. But none said a word. The heat bore down on them all. The silence wasn't just awkward. It was sacred. It was the silence of men who had seen something they couldn't unsee, and of women who had survived something they couldn't forget. And the dog had been right all along. Something was here, something unfinished, something not even war had put to rest. The silence wasn't just awkward, it was sacred. It was the silence of men who had seen something they couldn't unsee, and of women who had survived something they couldn't forget. Days earlier they had arrived not at a ranch, but behind the quiet gates of a POW camp in central Texas, a place that looked nothing like the nightmare they'd been promised. The truck that brought them had bounced over gravel roads, kicking up chalky clouds that clung to their skin and uniforms like second skin. As they passed through the checkpoint, the Japanese women didn't speak. Their hands rested in their laps, folded or fidgeting, the way they had learned to wait in silence, heads low, breath shallow. They had been told the Americans would beat them, strip them, humiliate them before dragging them to labor camps or worse. Instead, they were processed, like crates of supplies, with numbers written on tags, names scribbled down by bored American clerks. The first surprise was the stillness. No dogs barking, no screams, just the occasional cough of a diesel generator and the slow turning of a ceiling fan somewhere in the distance. A soldier at the gate offered one of the women water. She refused it without looking at him, expecting the gesture to be a trick. He said nothing, only shrugged and walked away. Another handed out small cloth bundles, a bar of soap, a washcloth, a change of undergarments, as though they were welcome gifts. The women stood in a row, shoulders rigid, waiting for the blow that never came. And still, no one explained why they were there, or how long they would stay. The assignment to the ranch came without warning. A corporal entered the women's barracks at dawn. He didn't speak Japanese, and the translator he brought with him spoke little more than broken instructions. Work, farm, go, today. There was no discussion, no explanation. Just 6 names read aloud, each one followed by a nod and then silence. The nurse was the last one called. She stood, heart knocking in her chest, uncertain if this was punishment or escape. The guards handed them boots, American-made, thick-soled, too large, and guided them toward a truck. As they climbed into the back, the sun had only just begun to rise, slashing the sky with a rust-red glow. The camp behind them remained hushed, a strange, self-contained world of fences, orderlies, and rules. The women whispered among themselves in clipped tones. One believed they were being sent to dig graves. Another thought perhaps they would be handed over to civilians for something worse. No one believed it would simply be farm work. The truck rolled on for miles. Dust coated their teeth. The women held onto the rails and stared out at a landscape that was foreign in every direction. Open plains stretching toward nothing, telephone wires marching across empty roads, cows grazing without fear. Then, from somewhere ahead, came the first bark. Faint, distant, but insistent. The nurse looked up, eyes narrowing. The hound again, she thought. Though she hadn't heard it before, something about the sound felt familiar. Not as a memory, but as a warning. As the truck neared the ranch, the barking grew louder, more urgent. The others heard it too. One flinched, another muttered a prayer, and then the truck stopped. There was a pause, just long enough for hearts to race. Then the tailgate dropped. Sunlight poured in. None of the women moved. The barking had stopped again, and in its place the silence returned, thick, expectant. They stepped down into the dust and denim of another kind of war. One not fought with bullets, but with looks and silence. And though they didn't know it yet, the real battle was just beginning. She hadn't seen his face before. Not really. Not until the dog barked. Not until he took off his hat and looked at her the way a man looks at a grave he never meant to visit. But in truth, their meeting had started long before Texas, years earlier on a different patch of soil where palms swayed in the wind and death came louder, faster, and redder. She had been a nurse on Saipan, or perhaps Okinawa. The names blurred now. What she remembered were the wounds, men screaming, pieces of them missing, limbs wrapped in canvas, eyes already half closed, their last breaths soaking into the jungle heat. She remembered digging into a thigh with trembling fingers, trying to find the artery before it burst. She remembered the mortar shell that landed 20 feet from her, how it didn't hit her, but took the man she had just bandaged. She remembered how the air had smelled of iodine and blood, of sweat and mildew, of fear that had no name in any language. They had been told it was a sacred duty, to heal, to serve, to die if necessary. What no one told them was what it would do to their minds, how the body might leave the battlefield, but the soul never would. And across the ocean, in the same war, but under a different flag, the cowboy had fought in a place where trees bled and dirt groaned. He had been 20 then, not yet a man by ranch standards, but they gave him a rifle and told him to take the hill. He took it, then lost it, then took it again. He watched friends fall, and once he killed a man so close he could see the fillings in his teeth. They never called it trauma. They called it duty. They called it winning. But his feet rotted from the damp. His hands shook even when the war was done. And he could never forget the way some of them fought, not to win, but to die. No surrender. Not even when they were bleeding out, dragging themselves forward just to pull a pin from a grenade. He had seen the kind of madness that honor could breed. And it stayed with him long after the bullets stopped. Now here they were, her in camp-issued boots too big for her feet, him in worn jeans and a limp earned from shrapnel that never quite got dug out. She hadn't expected to see a soldier here. He hadn't expected to see her alive. But memory doesn't care for place or peace. It lives in the lungs, in the nerves, in the way her shoulders flinched when he dropped his wrench, in the way his jaw clenched when she bent to pick up a bale of hay. The body remembers what the mind tries to bury. And in that one glance, something stirred. Not full recognition, but a flicker, like smoke from a fire long thought out. He saw not just a woman. He saw a battlefield walking on 2 legs. She saw not just a man. She saw the end of her war in the shape of a cowboy. Neither spoke of it. Not yet. But the dog had known. The dog had remembered first. By the time the sun rose fully over the plain, the ranch had slipped into motion. Fences needed mending. Hay needed lifting. Cattle waited to be fed, their groaning low and patient like time itself. The 6 women from the camp were divided into pairs, each trailed by 1 or 2 cowboys who offered no introductions. Orders were given with hand gestures more than words. Point to the post, point to the wire, nod, move. The rhythm settled in fast. Wire stretched, hammers struck, dust stuck to the back of throats. The women, though smaller and less trained, worked without complaint. Their movements were careful, deliberate, as though the land beneath them might break if they stepped too hard. The cowboys worked beside them, a few feet apart but a world away. The air pulsed with something unspoken. Not quite hate, not quite forgiveness. None of them knew what to call it. The cowboy with the limp watched the nurse from the corner of his eye. She was stronger than she looked. That much was clear. She lifted the hay bales without flinching, her arms trembling just a little by the third load, her breath shallow but steady. She didn't ask for help, didn't glance up. She moved like someone who had learned early that attention could be dangerous. He dropped a tool, a pair of pliers, and it clattered against the side of the trough. The sound rang out like a shot. She jumped. Not just flinched, jumped. The reaction was instant, as if muscle and bone remembered something she hadn't told them to forget. Her head whipped toward the noise, hands half lifted in defense, before she caught herself. He saw it, and for the first time really saw her. Not the uniform, not the nationality, not the enemy. He saw someone who had also been taught to brace for impact. He stooped to pick up the pliers without a word, brushing dust from the handle. She stared at the dirt for a moment, then turned back to her work. But something had shifted, just enough to be felt. Later, when the sun was high and sweat dripped down their temples, the same cowboy left a glove near the post where she worked. It wasn't offered, not out loud, but it was there. Her hands were raw from the wire. She noticed it, paused, then moved on. But the next time he looked, the glove was gone. No thank you, no nod, just a small theft of kindness neither of them could admit. Another cowboy passed around a jug of water. He handed it to each woman in turn, his face unreadable, eyes flicking downward as if unsure whether to meet theirs. When it reached the nurse, she hesitated. Her lips were cracked. Her fingers twitched. She took the jug, drank, passed it on. The last cowboy, younger than the others, offered a cigarette. He was awkward, unsure if the gesture would be accepted or spit on. The nurse shook her head, not rudely, just enough to say not today. He nodded, shoved the cigarette behind his ear, and moved on. The work continued. The fence got mended. The cows were fed. But the air between them had changed. It was still silent, yes, but no longer unbearable. It was the silence of people who didn't know how to speak, not the silence of those refusing to. And sometimes that's enough to start something, even if no one's ready to name it yet. The cow was old, stubborn, and unimpressed by war. It shuffled sideways in the pen, slow and heavy, chewing its cud like it had all the time in the world. The young woman from Nagoya stood too close, her boot planted just wrong, her attention fixed on the hay bale she was trying to move. The cow stepped sideways and landed square on her foot. The moment stretched, her face contorted, not in pain, but in disbelief. Then, without warning, she laughed. It was a short, shocked thing at first, the kind of laugh that escapes before the mind has time to decide whether it's allowed. But then it came again, higher, louder. The others turned to stare. Even the cows paused, ears twitching. Her hands flew to her mouth, but she couldn't stop. The sound pealed out into the air like a bell tolling at the wrong time. It was too bright, too human. And that's what made the cowboys freeze. The one with the limp stopped walking. His hand hovered over the fence rail. He stared at her, at the way her shoulders shook, at the way her face twisted with genuine amusement. She laughed like any girl might. At a dinner table, in a classroom, on a street somewhere far from Texas or war. Not like a prisoner, not like an enemy. Just a girl. He blinked, as if trying to shake the thought loose, but it stuck. For a moment, the others softened too. One scratched the back of his neck and chuckled under his breath. Another, the younger one, grinned outright, muttering something that made no sense but felt right anyway. Even the hound, always alert, tilted its head and let out a low, curious whine. The nurse glanced toward the girl from Nagoya, her own mouth twitching like she might smile, but wasn't sure if she was allowed. For so long, laughter had been dangerous, a thing punished, a thing watched. But now it fluttered through the pen like a loose piece of paper on the wind, impossible to catch. The cowboy with the limp looked away, but he couldn't help himself. He looked back. He watched the young woman wipe her eyes, shake her head, and mutter something in Japanese to her companion, a phrase he didn't understand but could guess the meaning of. Something about cows, or boots, or maybe just, "I forgot I could laugh." The day wore on. The heat climbed. But something had shifted. Later, during a break, the younger cowboy tried to say something. He crouched near the nurse, scratched the dirt with a stick, and said slowly, "Water." She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," she said, her accent thick. "Please." He handed her the jug. Their fingers brushed. The older cowboy watched from a distance, jaw tight, something unreadable in his expression. A while later, the nurse spoke again, quietly, to no one in particular, but with purpose. "Hot today," she said. The cowboy with the limp didn't answer, but after a long pause, he nodded once. "Sure is," he said. 2 words, nothing more, but they landed heavy. It wasn't peace, it wasn't trust, but it was real. And on that hot Texas day, surrounded by cattle and fences and things that didn't care who won which war, that was enough to make something small begin to grow. Something not yet named. Something that sounded, just faintly, like a future. The next morning, the routine returned, or at least what passed for routine now. The truck rumbled down the same dusty road, the same 6 women in the back, the same guard tapping his fingers against the metal frame. But something in the air had shifted. Maybe it was the echo of that laugh, still clinging to the ranch like wood smoke. Maybe it was the way the cowboys didn't look through the women anymore, but at them, cautiously, curiously, as if trying to reconcile the idea of an enemy with the very ordinary figures stepping onto their land. When the women climbed out, the nods came, subtle, stiff, barely there, but unmistakable. A chin lifted, a hat tipped, a murmured, "Mornin'," even if the speaker wasn't sure the word was understood. Nothing dramatic, nothing sentimental. But in a place where silence had once been a fortress, even the smallest gesture felt like a breach in the walls. Work began as always. Wire stretched, posts straightened, feed scattered, dust rose and settled on their hair, their clothes, their skin, and yet beneath the clatter and scrape, something new hummed beneath the surface. An awareness, a fragile, budding familiarity. It was the woman from Nagoya who crossed the next invisible line. During a break, she approached the cowboy who carried seed packets in his shirt pocket, a habit he'd had since boyhood, always ready to scatter a little life wherever the ground allowed. She pointed at the edge of one packet, then at the dirt beside the fence. "Seed?" she asked in halting English. He blinked. The request was small, harmless, but unexpected. He fumbled for a moment, then tapped the packet. "Corn," he said slowly. Then he placed it in her palm. Her fingers closed around it with a reverence he hadn't anticipated. She knelt and dug a tiny hollow in the dust. She planted one kernel, covered it gently, patted the earth. It wouldn't grow, not in this heat, not in this soil. Both of them knew that, but that wasn't the point. Nearby, another cowboy flicked open a cigarette lighter. Its flame jittered in the wind. One of the women flinched, not from fear, but from memory. He noticed, closed it without lighting anything. A moment later, he set it beside her as he passed. A gift, or a gesture, or maybe an apology none of them knew how to say aloud. Later, the nurse stood watching a loop of rope spin through the air. The younger cowboy practiced lassoing a post, each throw a smooth arc shaped by years of muscle memory. She didn't hide her stare. She watched with the stillness of someone memorizing every movement. "You want to try?" he asked, pointing to the rope. She hesitated. He stepped closer, slow enough not to startle her, and placed the rope in her hands. His fingers barely brushed hers, but even that was enough to send a tremor through the moment. He showed her how to position her wrist, how to let the rope swing freely. She attempted a throw. It landed nowhere near the post. She frowned. Tried again. The second loop flew wider. The cowboy laughed under his breath, not mocking, just soft, encouraging. She tried once more. This time, the rope landed close enough to count as progress. She didn't smile outright, but something in her eyes brightened briefly. Not victory, but possibility. The day wound down. Shadows lengthened. No one mentioned the seed planted in the dead soil. No one questioned the borrowed lighter or the shared rope. No one tried to define what was happening. But when the truck arrived to take the women back to camp, no one turned away. The cowboys stood by the fence, hats in hand or tucked under arms, watching as the women climbed aboard. Stillness, not peace. Uncertainty, not friendship. But something irreversible had settled into the dust. A quiet revolution measured not in battles won, but in moments survived, gestures exchanged, and the fragile understanding that human beings could share land, breath, and silence without drawing blood. The photo wasn't supposed to be there. He hadn't looked at it in months, maybe years. It had crept to the bottom of the saddlebag like some unwanted ghost, hiding beneath scraps of leather and worn cloth. But that morning, after patching a torn stirrup, the cowboy reached in for a rag and pulled it out instead. It was his brother, barely 20, grinning in uniform, cap tilted sideways, standing in front of a palm tree that didn't belong in Texas. It was taken weeks before he shipped out. Weeks before the telegram came, killed in action, Pacific Theater. No details, just a location and a date. The cowboy stared at the photo for a long time. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since the day he found out. But the ache inside his ribs returned, the slow, grinding kind that never went away. He slipped the photo back into the saddlebag without a word, but it stuck in his mind like a thorn under skin. Across the corral, the nurse moved with her usual calm. She had begun to carry a small satchel, not contraband, but worn and personal. Inside were scraps of cloth, 2 needles, a roll of thread, mending supplies, and a single photograph, carefully folded between pages torn from an old novel. Her brother, younger by 3 years, smiling without showing his teeth. She had last seen him on Okinawa, pressed against the cold concrete of a bunker wall as planes screamed overhead. He told her he would run supplies to the next post and be back by nightfall. She waited. Night fell. He never came back. Her commanders told her not to ask. Casualty of retreat. No body recovered. The photo was all she had left. She didn't look at it often, only when the nightmares left her gasping, or when she needed to remind herself that love could still live in memory. That day, the wind picked up. Dust spun across the yard in lazy whirlwinds. As she crossed the pen, her satchel slipped from her shoulder. The contents spilled across the ground, thread, cloth, a pencil stub, and the folded photo. She reached for it at the same time the cowboy did. They both froze. His photo had slipped too. Somewhere in the commotion the saddlebag had tipped. Now the two pictures lay side by side in the dust. Two young men, two different uniforms, two different fates. The wind died. No one spoke. Not the cowboy, not the nurse. She looked at his photo, then at her own, then back at him. And he, with lips pressed into a flat line, didn't pull away. For a moment the whole world narrowed to that patch of ground, to those two faces captured before death could claim them. It wasn't understanding, it wasn't reconciliation, it was the abyss that opens when grief recognizes itself in the eyes of an enemy. She collected her photo, brushing dirt from the edges. He did the same. Their fingers nearly touched, but no words came, because what could be said? Words were too small, too fragile, too dangerous. So they stood, shoulder to shoulder, bound not by history, but by loss. Then she turned away, and he let her, because in that moment silence was the only mercy either of them had left. The next day unfolded like any other, or so it pretended to. The women climbed down from the truck. The cowboys waited with their guarded nods, and the dust lifted from the ground in soft spirals as if the earth itself were trying to breathe easier. But beneath the familiar routine lay an undercurrent neither side acknowledged, a new awareness, a tremor in the space between steps, glances, breaths. Something had cracked open the day before, and though both tried to ignore it, the truth clung to them like Texas grit. The nurse worked farther from the others that morning, close to the fence line where the grass thinned and the shadows of mesquite branches stretched long and spindly. The cowboy with the limp kept a measured distance, repairing a rail but watching her from the edge of his vision, his movements slower than usual, his thoughts heavier. He did not want to look at her again. Not after yesterday, not after the photographs, but he found himself unable to help it. The dog sensed it first, its ears perked, body stiffening as it shifted from its lazy perch near a trough. Then came the low growl, deeper than before, primal, vibrating through the still morning heat. The nurse glanced over, paused in her work. The cowboy straightened. The dog's head dipped, eyes fixed on something in the grass. Another second of silence passed. Then the bark came, sharp, explosive, panicked. Not the warning from before, not the fear. This was something else entirely, a call to action, a command. The nurse froze. The cowboy did not. He moved without thinking, without breath, without asking permission. His boots thundered across the dirt as he lunged toward her. A flash of movement in the grass revealed the truth. A rattlesnake, coiled tight, its scales glinting like shards of glass, its tail rattling a furious rhythm. She didn't scream, she didn't flinch. She simply stood there, paralyzed by the sudden stillness of terror. He reached her in an instant, grabbing her arm, firm, urgent, protective, and pulling her behind him as the snake struck at empty air. The dog barked again, closer this time, circling, snarling, keeping the creature's attention. The cowboy snatched a long pole from the fence line and thrust it between himself and the snake. With a practiced sweep, he pinned it, pressed harder, and ended it. Silence fell, the kind that comes only after danger has passed, the kind that feels like a held breath slowly exhaled. He let go of her arm. She stared at him, eyes wide, breath unsteady, hand trembling where he had touched her. There were no words. There couldn't be. Not for this, not when language itself seemed too small for the moment. He looked back at her, not with pity, not with guilt, but with something stripped bare. Recognition, respect, something quiet and human and painfully fragile. The dog trotted between them, panting, satisfied with its heroics. It nudged the nurse's leg, then sat beside her as if declaring her under its protection now, too. She looked down, startled, then slowly placed a hand on its head. The cowboy's breath hitched just slightly at the sight. Something had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. They were no longer enemies, not quite allies, but something in between, a place neither of them had words for, a place carved by instinct, softened by memory, and sealed with a moment of shared danger neither would forget. When she finally stepped back, she bowed her head, not as a prisoner, not as an apology, but as a thank you spoken without sound. He touched the brim of his hat in return, and just like that, the walls that had taken years of war to build thinned enough for two people to simply be. If you've made it this far in the story, we'd love to hear from you. Like this video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. They got the notice at sunrise, a terse message from the guards at the main camp. The repatriation process had begun. The women would be transferred within the week, processed, and placed on a ship bound for Yokohama. Just like that. No warning, no ceremony, no chance to explain to the land, the animals, the strange people in denim and dust, that it had all come to mean something. The nurse folded the shirt he had lent her. He didn't know she'd kept it. It had once been draped over the back of a fence post on a cold morning, and when he noticed it was gone, he hadn't asked. Now she held it in her hands like something fragile. She brushed the dust from its seams with care, then tucked it into the bundle of things she would carry. Not back to Japan, but back to herself. The others packed, too. The girl from Nagoya ran a comb through her hair for the first time in days. Another wrote a single line on the inside of her boot with charcoal. We were here. It would fade, but it mattered. When the truck arrived for their final ride, it came earlier than expected. The ranch hands weren't ready, or maybe they simply hadn't believed it would happen so soon. The cowboy with the limp waited by the gate. In his hand was a small bundle wrapped in brown cloth. Inside was the wide-brimmed hat the nurse had once admired. She never said so out loud, but he had caught her gaze lingering on it more than once. A silent, impossible wish. Next to the hat was a locket. No one knew whose it had been. It had been found months ago in the bunkhouse, and no one had claimed it. So it became hers. He didn't hand it to her. He left the bundle on the fence post where she'd once left his shirt to dry. She saw it, walked to it, unwrapped it slowly. She didn't cry, but she stood a long time with the hat in her hands, the locket pressed against her chest like a pulse. He didn't move closer, but he watched. And when she looked up, across the dust, across the silence, their eyes met again. Not like before, not with the sharpness of enemies or the wariness of strangers, but with the heavy, quiet understanding of people who had seen one another's grief and not looked away. She nodded once. A half-smile tugged at her mouth. He responded with a lift of his chin. Then she turned and stepped onto the truck bed. The engine started with a low rumble. Dust kicked into the morning air. No one waved, not because they didn't care, but because some goodbyes are too sacred for gestures. As the truck rolled away, the dog let out a single bark. Not panicked, not warning, just a farewell, the kind of sound that lingers. He stood there long after they'd gone. The dust settled around his boots. The morning sun rose higher, and in the stillness, silence returned. But it wasn't the silence of forgetting. It was the silence of having once been seen. The sea looked the same. That surprised her. After everything, the bombs, the fire, the hunger, she had expected the water to reflect it all back. But it didn't. It shimmered with the same indifferent calm she remembered from childhood, as if the war had passed over it entirely. Her village had not been so lucky. Houses were missing walls, roofs gaped open like broken mouths, rice paddies lay dry and cracked. Children walked barefoot past shrines that no longer had names. She moved through the ruins slowly, each step echoing the weight of someone returned to a place that no longer knew her. The nurse carried little, a satchel, a folded shirt, and a photograph, not of her brother, but of herself, taken by an American soldier who had said nothing while capturing her in frame. He'd simply lifted the camera, nodded, and clicked. It had felt strange then. Now it felt like proof she had existed in that space between war and not war. In Texas, the sun rose hot against the horizon. The cowboy fixed the northern fence line, hands moving from habit more than necessity. The wood was warped, the nails rusted, but the work steadied him. Out here, no one asked questions. The dog lay beside him, tail thumping once every few minutes, as if to remind him he wasn't entirely alone. He finished hammering the last plank, stood back, and wiped his brow. Then, slowly, he sat in the dirt. The hat she had once worn, the one she had taken with her, was gone now. But a scrap of the cloth he had wrapped it in remained in his saddlebag. He pulled it out sometimes, not to weep, just to remember. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the photo. Her, standing by the barn, squinting against the light, mouth set in something almost like a smile. He hadn't meant to keep it. He'd found it beneath a hay bale days after they left. Maybe she had dropped it. Maybe she had left it. Either way, it was his now. He stared at it a long time. In Japan, she stood where her house used to be, a patch of land now overtaken by weeds and silence. She imagined him, on the other side of the world, tending to cattle, fixing fences, sipping something warm at dawn. Did he think of her? She didn't know. But she thought of him. Not often, not romantically, but in the quiet moments, when memory crept in like tidewater. She thought of the way he'd looked at her, the way he hadn't pulled back when the photos fell, the way he'd shielded her from the snake without hesitation. Not as a prisoner, not as a woman, but as a person worth saving. In Texas, the cowboy exhaled and let the photo rest in his lap. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. Some wars never end, but not all enemies stay that way forever. Fences can divide, but they can also be rebuilt. He looked across the open field, saw the grass bending with the wind, and knew she was somewhere out there, walking her own broken ground, carrying her own quiet burden. And maybe, just maybe, she was. Remembering, too, not the war, but what came after. The silence, the dog, the look that passed between two people who had every reason to hate and chose not to. If this story moved you, leave a like and comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts.